The Canadian migration was going to take too long. My father didn't want to take up family opportunities in America. He wanted to be independent, and an opportunity to migrate to Australia came up. They left everything and came to a new land.
So we arrived. We arrived here on my 7th birthday. My father used to say to me afterwards, he loved Central Europe. He used to hike all through the mountains. He knew the vegetation, he knew the flowers, he knew the trees. And he came here and there was nothing that he could recognise.
The first thing I touched was my father, which I hadn't seen. I was 9 and I never met my father.
A lot of people who've come by ship are losing touch with the fact that they're migrants, and we as a nation need to know that we are a migrant nation.
The Port Melbourne Piers played key roles in maritime history and also historical events that have shaped and sustained Australia. And probably most recognisable is both Station and Princes Pier were a gateway to the nation and the first point of contact with Australia for over 1 million post-World War II immigrants. When you think about 1 million people arriving at Port Melbourne between 1947 and 1971, and that Australia's population at the end of that period was around 10 or 11 million, that means that around 1 in every 10 people that were living in Australia at that time arrived in Port Melbourne. And that's one of the reasons that people feel so strongly and have a deep affection for the Port Melbourne Piers.
For onlookers, the departure of these people was a moving experience.
At the end of the war, there was about 2 million people living in displaced persons camps in Europe.
Where before they had been exhausted, stunned by the cataclysm of war, now there was eagerness, excitement and hope in their bearing.
My father had married my mother in 1941 in contravention of the Nuremberg marriage laws, which forbade Aryans to marry Jews. Now, it was a secret marriage. By that time, being married to a Jew was a problem because Stalin had already started weeding out people with Jewish connections and Jewish heritage within the Soviet government. So my father read the wind. It's then that he planned his escape.
My parents both came from a small Austrian country town called Pinkerfeld. At the time they were considering migrating, Austria was still occupied by the Russians. After Russian occupation, they stripped all the infrastructure, so there was very little work to be had. Because of the economic uncertainties and there was no certainty that Russia would let Pinkerfeld go, my parents decided that they would leave for better opportunities.
I turned 4 on the day that we left, and I can still remember my parents saying to me, "Helen, we're going to Australia." And I can still remember this, in Australia, they're trying to make me excited. "Helen, it's a very long way away." And my parents were really waiting for an opportunity to come to Australia, and it actually took them 2 years from the time they applied until the time that they could come. And that was mainly because of the White Australia policy.
We were attached to the next going boat, shipped to Australia, and my strong memory was sitting on the wharf next to this box, waiting to see if there would be any reserves on the ship. This as an address is amazing. It's called MZika, Australia. So of course We didn't know where we were going except that it was Australia. So there we were, sitting huddled together with our box and a couple of cases and this hat box, waiting to see if we would get onto that ship.
It was my kinder year. I never went to kinder. I went to sing-alongs in the ship with the other children, and I can still remember sitting cross-legged in a room with other children. That was the first time I'd ever done that type of thing before. And people were up the front doing a little bit of entertainment for children, and we learned 10 green bottles hanging on the wall, and we learned there's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza.
I felt strange in the ship because I don't have an English background, and the ship was specifically for English people, so I was quite isolated from the rest of the passengers. But I do remember not having a country to call my own, not having a home, not having a job, no income. I had my wife, 2 children, and my mother-in-law, and yes, it did feel strange. On the way from Britain to Australia, we stopped at Aden, and that's where I bought my camera.
We were able to buy fresh vegetables in Colombo off the little trading canoes that came up alongside the ship. Those who came by ship all remember they would throw the ropes up with a weight on them up onto the ship, and then with a pulley and a basket they do all the trading up and down.
We embarked for Melbourne via Southampton, about 5.5 weeks at sea. I kept to myself. I was quite introverted on the trip back. I didn't relate well to the English migrant children. And it wasn't until we arrived at Fremantle that something clicked.
So we arrived. We arrived here on my 7th birthday.
This is a picture of us queuing up to disembark. So the ship is docked at Port Melbourne, and we had to wait for a while, and as my mum was telling me, I did remember a lot of unusual things happening, you know, sitting up high and waiting and not really understanding what was going on. I was only 4 years old at the time. Then I remember us walking along a very long path.
Over the next few decades, Princes Pier became largely unused, and in 1985 it was decommissioned. It was then declared a hazard and basically barricaded off from the general public in the early 1990s. In 2006, a major conservation project was embarked upon to restore Princes Pier. An important part of the project involved refurbishing the 1936 gatehouse so that it could be used again, and retaining the outer 360 metres of timber pylons as what I think is a stunning feature of the restoration that gestures to the immense scale of the original structure. The pier was reopened in December 2011. It returned the pier to the community. People were breaking down in tears because of the memories that it brought back, themselves as a young child, or perhaps thinking about their parents that first set foot there, and what a journey and what a big undertaking that would have been, and a scary undertaking.
I think I'm one of those quite rare people who can genuinely say they arrived on their birthday, and as my father said to me, this is your present. And I've never looked back.